It seems as if graffiti or deliberately slashed car tyres have now been replaced by cyber attacks, computer viruses, scams, and social media abuse, all aimed at infiltrating and destroying people's lives. In Jesus' time, there were also many ways of undermining and damaging a rival who might also be a neighbour. One of the most common was to deliberately sow seeds in the neighbour's field. It was a sure way of getting even with your fellow farmer if you were in dispute with him. You might even succeed in ruining him. It became such a common practice that the Romans passed a law against it. So Jesus knew this parable would resonate with all his listeners. As a teenager, it was a parable that often sent me scurrying home from Sunday church, disturbed and confused. For preachers used the explanation section of the parable to frighten folk into believing. If you didn't believe and act righteously, then the harvest judgment seemed to point you to an inevitable fiery hell and lots of gnashing of teeth. But God is not first and foremost like that. He doesn't follow us around constantly flourishing a yellow card for our every mistake and getting ready for the final day when he can send us off the field with a grim red one. So more recently I started to ask myself, why is the parable and the explanation only in Matthew's Gospel? And why does the Gospel of Thomas, not included in the New Testament, outline the same parable, but the Jesus explanation section, requested by the head-scratching disciples, is missing? I dug a bit deeper and became convinced by the arguments of two great experts on Jesus' parables. They say that the interpretation part of the parable misses the obvious point Jesus was making, which is a demand for patience, the need to watch and wait. Also, Matthew uses a number of linguistic expressions that Jesus never ever used elsewhere, such as angels of the Son of Man in verse 41. So their conclusion is that the explanation ascribed to Jesus is really Matthew's take on what Jesus was saying. So the interpretation of the wheat and weeds parable is the work of Matthew himself. Matthew was recasting the true emphasis of the parable. You see, the principal purpose of the parable was to impress on the impatient disciples and the impatient crowd the need for patience, insisting that this time for separation of wheat and weeds had not yet come. God does not make hasty judgment. He takes his time. So the farm workers in the parable were told to hang fire. Today we live in a complex world, a coexistence of many opposites. Wheat and weeds grow together side by side. Pride, greed, anger, envy, alongside humility, generosity and helpfulness. And there's similarly real tensions within each one of us. None of us, given our human nature, are ever completely a sinner or a saint, but a combination of good and bad, wheat and weeds. An old Cherokee Indian once told his grandson about a fight that was going on inside him. He said it was a very fierce tussle, and it was between two wolves. One was nasty and evil, full of anger and arrogance, greed, gossip, resentment. The other wolf was peaceful and good, full of joy and love, kindness, generosity, compassion and truth. The grandson thought for a moment and then asked, "Which wolf do you think will eventually win?" The old Cherokee slowly replied, "The one I feed. The one I feed." The real problem is trying to identify the wheat and weed growing within us. As the green-fingered among you might know, darnel, the poisonous weed Jesus was referring to, is very hard to distinguish from wheat. They look alike, and only when they are both well established can you tell them apart. At that point, if you try to remove the darnel, you will also pull out the wheat, because the roots of both have become interwoven. The challenge for would-be followers of Jesus, the wheat, is to push our roots deeper into Jesus so as to outgrow the weeds, thus making some of the weeds wither. Together with Jesus, we in effect become the selective weed killer. Last Sunday there was a disturbing Sky News headline. It said, "It's taken over. Killer pygmy weed from New Zealand, putting British lakes at risk." It reminded me of a true story. In the 1990s, a well-known politician had a teenage daughter who did her own thing, got into a number of compromising situations, featured very scandalously in a glossy magazine. Whilst her father became a Conservative cabinet minister, the daughter moved to Scotland and joined the Anti-Capitalist League. Because of her lifestyle and the embarrassment it continued to cause, she had no contact with her parents for a number of years. Over time, she changed and realised the need to be reconciled. But she dared not telephone her parents, so she wrote her father a letter saying she was travelling to London by a certain train and would he like to meet up again. She realised he might not want to do this, but if he did, would he tie a white handkerchief on the apple tree in the family garden, which was beside the railway line in Hertfordshire? As the train neared the key stretch of line, she became very nervous and asked a fellow passenger to look out for an apple tree and a white handkerchief in a garden just after a long stretch of green railing. She couldn't look herself. They passed the house and she asked her travelling companion if he'd seen a white handkerchief on the tree. "No," he replied, "but I did see a tree totally covered in white sheets and a man standing on a ladder waving an enormous white flag." The daughter had begun to separate the good from the bad in her life, and the love and unending patience of the mother and father had seen a small harvest. So what lessons does the parable teach us about trying to be Jesus followers, to be kingdom people now? Well, firstly, Jesus does not judge us by using what I call balance sheet Christianity. He doesn't believe in 52% wheat, good deeds, 48% weed. He recognises we are pulled in different directions. Secondly, he encourages us not to make quick judgments of others. By delaying a harvest, more of the crop can be saved, more of the weed turned into wheat. He also encourages us to be tolerant and kind in our judgment. And he urges us to be patient, to take time, to think and decide, above all to recognise our own faults. And finally, he urges us to constantly confront our inner self, to ask ourselves how much of me is wheat and how much of me is weed, and what am I doing about it? But above all, remember, the Lord is merciful and forgiving and constantly loving. So let us grow as wheat as we try to follow his teaching. Amen.